I'm Jude Kelly. Welcome. I founded WOW, Women of the World, 11 years ago, and I did it on International Women's Day. And I did it because 11 years ago, I was concerned that women, and particularly young women, were not aware of the incredible history of struggle and change that had made such a difference to women all over the world. And the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day, as I celebrated it 11 years ago, was my effort to say, look, the struggle's still on. There's so much to do still. Let's join hands across the world and recognize that and do something about it. And of course, something about it has been being done for many, many years since then, in all kinds of extraordinary ways. And one contribution is that WOW has become a global movement. And as we can see from WOW Pakistan, the range of voices, thoughts, ideas are something to celebrate. And WOW is really a place of celebration. We want to demonstrate the magnificence of achievement of girls, women, trans and non-binary people everywhere as they reach out to say equality is a matter of human justice, human right, and also what an amazing world it will be when we are equal. And I say when, not if, because I think unless we together have this idea of absolute faith that this change will happen, then we can't find the momentum and the stamina to keep going. And I do believe that stamina relies a lot on optimism, and optimism comes from hearing wonderful stories, stories of resilience, stories of survival, but also stories of just great happy chance, all the things that women have always dreamt about, and when those opportunities come for their dreams to come true. So this particular WOW moment, we're not only joined in Pakistan, but we have at the moment WOW in Turkey, in Istanbul, in New York, in Bangladesh, they're doing think-ins, in Taiwan, they're doing think-ins. We've got WOWs in Australia, in Rio. So it's a really extraordinary world movement that we hope, as you're watching this, that you'll join. I'm hosting this final panel for this marvelous festival. It's been a period of great richness and great contrast and all the things that you want a WOW festival to be, but of course, not live, online, which we'll be talking about in a minute. And I have here a tremendous group of guests. I'm going to introduce them as I ask them questions. We together are going to be thinking about the future for women and girls during pandemic, post-pandemic, and perhaps a longer journey than that in terms of the dreams that we have for them and each other. So let me start by introducing Salima Hashmi, who is an artist, curator and contemporary art historian. In fact, her book, Unveiling the Visible, Lives and Works of Women Artists of Pakistan, was really quite a groundbreaking piece. And I suppose in some way relates to the theme of this festival about unmasking, because it really laid bare both the creative juice and the determination of the lives of the women of Pakistan who chose to be artists. Salima, you've founded many organizations, you've led many institutions. I'm an artist too, and in my lifetime, I have never seen the arts that we rely on for stories to be so pushed back out of public space, out of the limelight, out of an economy that it relies on, since most people who are working in the arts are freelance. So tell me what you think the arts has been able to do during the pandemic, and also what fears you have for it at the moment.
Well, I think one of the things that this pandemic has done is that it's given us the time for self-reflection, and also of thinking back at the struggle of women, and then thinking, okay, so how can we use that and make it our strength as we go forward? One of the things that I have, well, going back in my memory, I've looked at women's struggle for peace in our region. I mean, I was a 4-year-old child when 1947 happened and the massacres were taking place. And my mother had brought me and my baby sister to Murree on our way back to Lahore. And there had been a lot of bloodletting then. So the women in Murree got together and they decided to take out a demonstration for peace. And 4 years old, I was put on a donkey, the donkey rides type donkey in this hill station. I was given a white flag to carry, and I led that demonstration. And I've kind of not let that white flag go down ever. And I have been there, and I'm happy to say, you mentioned the book. I think that women in Pakistan have been in the forefront at very difficult moments, like the pandemic. And I have seen that, while I've been looking back at history, looking back at the women's movement in the time of the dictator Ziaul Haq, and how when all the political parties were silenced, it was a women's movement that took off. And it was women artists who were very much in the forefront. It was their work when they decided, okay, we're not going to do state-sanctioned art. We're not going to paint pretty landscapes or do calligraphy, which was being demanded. We're going to do other things, which they did. My own work was about the female form and about taking off the clothes and saying, okay, this is the body and this is what we are forbidden to do. So this is what we are going to do. We're going to talk about the measures which are the state taking over the right of the body, and so on and so forth. I think certain similar things have happened during the pandemic, when in fact it's been very difficult to make work, it's been very difficult to show work. I've been so inspired by the fact that so many young women, A, have continued to work, and B, they have continued to make certain resources available. They have curated shows, online shows. They have managed to persuade certain galleries to host those shows, even while all the work is going online. They have been writing about the arts. There have been so many panels, discussions online, talking about work, talking about the struggle, talking about the enormous pressures on women during the pandemic in Pakistan, elsewhere, the violence against women that has increased, and making that somehow the subject of what they're talking about. So I think women have done, more than they were able to, considering all the problems. And one is proud today, women are marching. They're marching all over Pakistan, and they're marching in places where they would not have been allowed to enter public spaces. And I fear that there's going to be resistance, because that's what women. But I also understand that the theme this year is women's health. That's the theme of all the marches, because we know that that has been one of the major problems during the pandemic, is the woman's health, both mental and otherwise, and the fact that the state does not provide resources. So I'm very glad that the marches this year have this very strong theme. And as we are speaking, because we're talking at a particular time where I know that women are getting ready, they're taking out their banners and they're taking to the streets. And there will be resistance, we know that too, but it's not the first time. And it's not the last time. You said we are still at the beginning of a very, very long journey. We have to fight for our sisters. We have to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves.
So I think that's a wonderful account of the fact that we know that women are able to determine for themselves that they will be in public space. And we also know that artists in particular, whose vocation is to tell a story of themselves and society, are still finding ways and means of doing that. But you talked about the impact of health, women's health. And I want to talk to both Kulsoom and Stevie about that. Kulsoom, I'm going to come to you first. Kulsoom Gayas, you're an associate professor and chair of the Department of Biological and Biomedical Sciences at the Aga Khan University in Karachi. And you have a very long history of medical research. And I was noticing that particularly your research is into leukemia and cancer, different kinds of cancers. So watching the whole health service sort of pivot or go on hold or whatever, however you would describe it, in order to deal with this pandemic, might have been painful in terms of the progress that you've been trying to make. It's necessary, but painful. But you've been watching the front line, and certainly in many of the places around the world that I've been talking to, it's women on the front line mainly. It's women doing underpaid, undervalued roles, and yet they're day and night putting their lives literally in danger, and basically not expecting anything in return, because that's what society has just made as an expectation of them. What's your current sense of the health of the nation in Pakistan with regard to its own health workers?
Jude, thank you so much for inviting me and for asking such an insightful question. You're absolutely right. Women, and traditionally within the health sciences, this has been one of the accepted professions in a country like Pakistan for women to be doctors, or Aga Khan University particularly really was a standard bearer for promoting nursing as a really honorable profession amongst women. Um, it's been, as you've said, the world over, the women have been on the front lines. If you take the example of Pakistan, it's within the healthcare sector. It's not just the physicians and the nurses, it's the nursing aides, it's women making decisions as far as hospital management and healthcare is concerned. And particularly within the diagnostic spectrum as well. So there are many examples of women scientists being on the forefront within Pakistan and beyond in putting forth some of the initial tests that were responsible for testing COVID variants. For women leading the clinical trials, again, not just in Pakistan, but certainly beyond. And finally, women scientists being responsible for the COVID vaccine, from which many of us are benefiting. It's been hugely frustrating, I'm sure, for many people, and this is men and women included in the sciences, to have a lot of our work come to because we did not have access to, if you talk about my cancer research in particular, we didn't have access to materials and consumables. We had to protect our staff. And there were many considerations that slowed down the pace of what was our regular work. It hasn't gone unnoticed. In fact, it's been channeled towards resources that have benefited the fight against COVID within the country. It has meant, though, that it's taken a toll on all of us because we have been working really unprecedented hours, and this goes for all the women and the men in the healthcare sector across the world, because it's about taking care of our professional responsibilities, but that translates into certain dangers that we all felt we were taking home when we went back to our loved ones and families. And so protecting them, especially when in the initial months when it was very, very unknown, protecting our children. I went a couple months without even seeing my parents and my grandmother in person because we just weren't sure how much risk we were exposing them to. But as a community, I really have to hail in Pakistan the healthcare community that whether it's been celebrated or not, they have really come forward in response to the pandemic, as we've seen the world over.
Mm-hmm. Let me talk, Stevie, to you, because you are both the chair of the British Council worldwide from August 2019, but you're also chair of Mind, which is a mental health charity. And it's been a big part of your life to always think about not just the sort of the physical aspects of somebody's health, but the mental health issues in all kinds of ways. Now, the mental health has become something which we are more familiar with now, more able to talk about. There's less shame attached to it, all of which is really, really good. But I would think this pandemic has exacerbated many conditions, but also revealed conditions, revealed underlying anxieties, and just brought on, sheer terror at the idea of poverty, at the idea of illness, surrounded by real morbidity, etc. How running a huge institution like the British Council with staff right across the world, all experiencing different things in different ways, how do you attend to something like mental health, not in a bureaucratic way, but in a humane and personal way? What's the methods you use?
Thanks, Jude. And I think that humane and personal are both words that come to mind in how we're approaching the challenge, because there is absolutely no doubt that the global physical health challenge is being met with a global mental health challenge that will turn into a mental health crisis, particularly for those people who were already dealing with some fragile mental health prior. It's all been exaggerated. And trying to keep 15,000 colleagues safe around the world within the confines and the structure of the British Council, you will not be surprised to know that mental health is high on what we're trying to do in terms of keeping colleagues safe beyond the COVID secure changes that we're making. So, it's no surprise we do mental health awareness courses and they're online for all staff. We have a big part to play in Time to Talk Day and Time to Change. And probably the most important thing that we do, because when you've got that many people in that many places around the world, you are dependent on line managers. And the most important thing we do, I think, is encourage our leaders at all levels to look after themselves first, which can feel counterintuitive. But it's a bit like you were talking about unmasking earlier. It's a bit like when you're on an aeroplane, you have to put your own oxygen mask on first before you can help anybody else. So I think it's really, really important that we're encouraging line managers to look after themselves, to help build their own resilience before, alongside them helping other people. And part of that is trying to encourage a culture of openness and support, because you will have heard me say this 1,000 times. The culture of an organization is what drives it, much more than the strategy that you're going through. I think also to repeat what colleagues have already said, the crisis has most affected those who are already fragile, particularly women, because it's women who are coping at the forefront, not just of dealing with the crisis, the health crisis in hospitals and at the coalface, but in the home. They're the ones coping with the extra bereavement. They're the ones coping with the extra caring responsibilities, with the extra stress. And I think that, supporting what Salima just said, they're the ones locked up in home in an abusive relationship when they're not allowed out. So yes, we are all in this together, but we are certainly not all in this together equally. And I think that our role as leaders is to make sure that we are being kind to each other and to our colleagues. We're challenging for change, to come back to the theme of the day, and we are making sure that our colleagues stay well, or if they are unwell, that they get well, or if they tip over into a more severe and enduring problem, that we help them to learn to live well with that diagnosis. There's a lot that we can do, but being kind to each other is a good starting point.
I think this has tested the imagination and the empathetic imagination of many, many leaders, who themselves, our own upbringings maybe teach us to kind of stay buttoned up about emotions. How do we then provide the right way of talking to staff who need to explore their feelings? It's a very complex landscape. And when we talk about we'll build back better, right very early on, there were some phrases that came out of it. We'll build back better, we're all in this together. I remember Rebecca Solzhenitsyn saying, well, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all sailing on the same boat. Some are in huge liners and some are in inflatable dinghies that are just about to collapse. And I think that it's a while until we'll see the debris on the shore, the economic debris, the emotional debris. And during that time, of course, there's been a huge debate about power, not just the Black Lives Matter conversation, which is absolutely central as well in terms of mental health for many, but also the whole idea, as you say, about violence in society against women, about underpaid and undervalued people. The reset will be very, very demanding ethically, I think. Sushi Saluja, can I come to you? Obviously, you are somebody who's been working for 30 years in the whole territory of technology, how business has used and forged its relationship with technology to make a faster global economy, a faster world of communication, etc. And you've always been very committed to the idea of education, good education around technology. We have a reason to celebrate where we are at the moment in terms of digital advancement, because it's allowed forums like this to exist, where thousands of people who wouldn't be able to be there in the flesh are actually joining online, and that's magnificent. But there is a but, isn't there? Which is that it's exposed the digital divide in a huge way. I mean, in the UK, the digital divide means that kids who only might have one device in the house, if that, are all trying to do their homework on that one device, which is probably their mum's phone. And then there are other people who, aren't allowed to even have a phone if they're in a difficult relationship, etc. And there's huge problems now about assuming that society has just jumped into this digital space, whilst realizing many people aren't there, can't be there, and won't be there unless we take a very systematic approach to closing this digital divide. What's your sense of how concerned people are about it, and what remedies you think are being urged forward through governments and businesses?
Thanks, Jude. Great question. Before I answer that, just a couple of quick points, if I may. Firstly, thank you for having me on the panel as the only man on the panel today. It's a great honour and privilege on this day. And secondly, I was very moved by some of the comments earlier, particularly those from Salima. And as the son of two parents who both separately experienced great hardship in the partition of 47, that's something which certainly runs through my own family background and something which I could relate to, particularly the analogy of raising the white flag. So very moved by those. On your question specifically around digital, you're absolutely right. The pandemic has accelerated many of the trends, but also exposed many of the fault lines, and you've outlined some of the key fault lines. I think in some ways we have to look at this as a paradox. We have to remain excited about the opportunities that arise, but also recognize some of the issues and frustrations and deal with those. I think particularly in the area of learning and education that you talked about, we have seen that move quite quickly, and we have seen, as you say, a lot of emphasis on some of the infrastructure components. And in some ways, that's a bigger challenge in some parts of the world than other parts of the world. In other ways, it's also an opportunity. And I think in the short term, there's no doubt that infrastructure is one of the key enablers that will help avoid digital divides, and continuing to focus on that, including broadband, including connectivity, I think is something that everybody will need to worry about. Where we've seen that work well, and where we've seen countries leapfrog technologies, that's been hugely successful. And you only have to look at some of the electronic payments in East Africa to see that where countries have decided to move to rapid mobile deployment, that actually that can be hugely beneficial in accelerating the take-up and reducing the divide. I think there are probably three things I would pull out. The first is to continue to focus on the enablers and the infrastructure. And I think there's some very positive signs in all parts of the world, but much more needs to be done. Secondly, we often underestimate the human capital and the human implications of moving to the digital world. It's not only the idea of digital fatigue, which many people have. It's not only the shift in that comes from looking at a screen, but also some of the domestic implications that follow from that, but also some of the digital savviness that's required to be able to move to that. And I think all of these take time. I think we should just recognize those explicitly and deal with those explicitly. And thirdly, I think we shouldn't be afraid to be able to say that we want to start small, get the basics right, both in infrastructure and human terms, and then focus on scaling fast. I think scaling fast can only really happen when you've got some of the infrastructure and human aspects right. And that does take time, particularly in different parts of the world. So those would be some of the things I would just highlight on that point, Jude.
And incidentally, please don't apologize for being here as a man. I want to stress all the time that I don't believe that we can have global equity unless we're all involved. We all have to care. We all have to be part of it. I know that you're a feminist and you're there to make the world better for all of us. So, you know, it's a really key thing. I think that we don't bring men on board in order to just sort of prop up our arguments. We bring men on board because if they're like you, it matters to your life and your ethical position. So, you know, I just want to say that we have to keep involving all of us together. So thanks for everything that you do, Sushil, as well on the British Council. I'm going to come to Natasha Ansari now. Hi, Natasha. Because listening to what Sushil's saying about, you know, in a way, make sure that you're bedding in at the right level changes so that when they scale, they don't distort. You know, I'm thinking particularly about the, you know, we have huge problems with AI because we've scaled it really quickly, but we didn't understand that the female voice within AI was absent by and large because the design was done by men and not taking into account women. You have done so much in the area of looking at urban design, looking at sort of research generally on the way society operates. And you've taken those thoughts and turned it into support for activism. You know, co-founded the Girls at Davos Feminist Initiative, looking at how you can have more conversations about the right for women in public spaces. This moment of the pandemic, do you think this is galvanizing women's activism and girls' activism? And do you think that business and government are now recognizing the need to give women and girls the tools for that activism to permeate into long-standing and effective change?
At this moment in the pandemic, I definitely think, I mean, because how confined we have been indoors, I feel like I've been seeing more women right outside my street walking and, you know, claiming public space within their own neighborhoods. And that's not even, you know, consciously done. So I do feel like, you know, this is like kind of forcing people to like navigate relationships and their positionality maybe as women and gender norms at home. In terms of, could you repeat your question about business and, yeah.
Do you think that governments and businesses are recognizing the impact that the pandemic's having negatively on girls and women, and that they're going to use their forces to try to make change? You know, do you think they want to support more activism as a result?
I'm not sure about business and government doing that directly, but I do see like movements like the Aurat March certainly highlighting those issues and, you know, talking about maybe increased domestic violence at home as a result of the pandemic and issues like that. And so the awareness is being generated from the feminist circles for sure. I think the uptake we are still yet to see.
And there's a lot of conversations about girls' mental health in particular around the world. And I'm wondering whether you think that, I've often felt that girls were the last in line to get support, to get attention, to get visibility. Is that still the case in the pandemic?
Absolutely, I think. I mean, personally at home, I've seen how much intensive care labor has been involved. We have a disability at home. My brother was disabled. So just how much that, how the pandemic kind of exacerbated responsibilities around that, and how much of that was invisible and how much of that was unpaid labor. You know, like I couldn't even imagine the amount of things that went into his care to be considered unpaid labor, and that kind of falling mostly on women's shoulders is kind of, it's unfathomable to me that this is not recognized.
It's been true in the UK that there is a huge disparity in terms of housework done by girls as opposed to boys.
Yeah.
And so over and over again, the statistics are saying women are having an undue and detrimental experience massively during
Yeah.
COVID in all kinds of ways, having to give up their jobs first, having to
Yeah.
furlough first, etc. And the mental strain of homeschooling, as well as caring generally. So I'm just going to come to my final question before I talk to the curators. Rachel, to you, you're the Deputy Chair of the British Council, but you have a lifelong experience in looking at business and government and the economies of trying to balance financial sort of security with societies being progressive. And at the moment, when you look across the world, do you think that we are looking at governments rethinking their attitude to women and women's needs? We've had so much conversation about, as I say, build back better. We've had plenty of evidence that COVID, like many crises, has a huge and detrimental impact on women. But I personally am not hearing the narrative from governments that go, okay, we're going to start with women. We're going to start with women and girls. We'll get that right, and then everybody else will benefit. What's your sense of that dialogue at top government level at the moment?
Well, I think governments are hugely challenged by what has been a massive natural disaster, which the like of which no one's really had to tackle in this generation or the previous one. So they're completely focused on getting through the pandemic, tackling the public health crisis, and just, if they're supporting people who've been most hit by through crude income transfers, furlough schemes, huge spending of money just to get through to the other side. So do I think that much really serious thought has gone into, thinking about what the better life at the other side will look like? From where I sit in the UK, I think the honest answer is no. There's a lot of talk about building back better, but it's mostly people digging out things that they wanted to do anyhow, and dusting off the old agendas. I do think, though, that I don't feel completely pessimistic about it. I think what this crisis has done is thrown a very harsh light on existing inequities in our society, gender, racial, and all the rest of it. And that has, you can see through the Black Lives Matter, which I think you actually can't completely separate from the pandemic. I think that it was, the emotion behind it was partly fueled by the sense of crisis. I think that has produced a much sharper focus on very long-standing racial injustice in business, as well as and governments respond to what their populations think. So I do hope that one of the things that this crisis may have done is fueled a political mood which may influence governments the other side of the crisis. Because I think the other thing that has become very clear is how dependent society is on underpaid people who work in the front line. Not just the nurses and the healthcare workers and the carers who are looking after people, but the delivery guys. And I think that sense that society is being supported by very underpaid key workers is part of hopefully helping to build a slightly different political mood, which might fuel change in the future, not for now. Now, do girls focus on all this? No, to a disappointing extent they don't. But I think to the extent that the reason why this crisis, like so many others, has hit women worst is because they're the most vulnerable. They don't have economic power. They don't have, in many cases, political power. And I think that the focus has got to be on giving women the power to be listened to.
Yeah.
And the thing that I worry about most, which we haven't talked about, so I did want to just put it on the table, is the impact of this crisis on young people and their interrupted education. And the people, the most privileged young people probably haven't been that much disadvantaged by interrupted schooling, but you can be absolutely certain that the least privileged and those who aren't in full-time education at all, and there are too many of those in Pakistan, those are the ones that have really suffered. And I think a really pressure on governments for a really focused catch-up program for young people is something that would benefit women, but I think is necessary really in terms of intergenerational equity as well. Because I'm painfully aware that, you know, my grandchildren's generation are paying the price for safeguarding my life. You know, a lot of this is the intergenerational unfairness of all this is terrible, really. And I think the one thing that governments should be focusing on is making it up to young people, people whose education's been interrupted, particularly the ones that, you know, for whom education is the most important. Because, you know, if you were to say, well, what has been the real engine of progress for women over the last century? It's been education. Girls' education is just so hugely important. And I think the idea that it might have suffered as a result of this pandemic is the thing that kind of grieves me most, and the thing that I think there should be the most pressure on governments to focus on the other side if we ever get to it, to this pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's why the conversation that Salima at one end of the generations has referred to, and Natasha at the other end of, you know, the need to change the cultural attitude within countries so that ordinary girls and women feel they have rights intrinsically and they're expecting those rights and they can articulate those rights. That is what changes governments. You know, things don't change top down, they change bottom up. And that's why we just need to keep on giving those tools of confidence and rights to everyone. Amne and Kanwal, there you are, sort of, you know, you're listening in on all of this and looking at the program, which has covered everything from martial arts to Malala. This has been a festival, again, like all the WOW festivals, that says whoever you are and however small you think you are, your story does matter. It's the collective stories that can change the world. What for you has given you a sense of optimism, stamina to carry on making change? Amna, can I start with you? What would you say that the highlights of the festival have been? I mean, you've been in social development for years as an entrepreneur, as interested in community development in every way. What's been a sense that this festival has brought online, which it perhaps couldn't do in the flesh?
Thank you, Jude. I'm really excited to be here and to be talking about all the work that we've done this year. It's been challenging, I think. I mean, in terms of the digital aspect of it. I think we've referenced the fact that in some ways it allowed us to include people, to have this panel, for example. I think it's an excellent example of what we would not have been able to achieve the festival, take additional physical form. But in terms of, you know, what we lost, obviously, is I do worry a little bit about the inclusion. I mean, there's a lot of people who couldn't come online, who couldn't join us. I know we did try, and I think Kaveh will speak to that a little bit about how we tried to do a little bit in regional languages. The festival was PSL interpreted. It is captioned in Urdu for conversations that did take place in English. But that is only for those people who are actually able to log in and access it. But in terms of why I do this work, I think that was the first thing you asked. And I mean, part of it is, I think it's a continuum across a lot of the work that I do in the gender space, but it's a sense of community. I think what WOW has been able to give me, and it delivers year on year. This year, I was looking at earlier last night, we were all looking at the list of women that we worked with this year in some which way and form. I mean, just on our list of delegates, it's over 125 incredible women. And I think it's that community, it's the energy that you get, it's the inspiration that you get. I feel so incredibly privileged because quite often I leave this forum with new friends, with so many new ideas, with so much more stamina, as you said, and so much more energy to keep doing what it is we do, which can sometimes seem quite thankless and not rewarding unless you're in that community space where you realize how much that you're not alone.
Yeah, well, I'm going to end with you, Kanwal, even though, you know, this is the last word, I want you to have it, but partly because the curators said to me at the beginning, well, you know, leave us till last because we're just the people who are doing the work. And I said, that's so typical of women to say, well, you know, I'll do all the work, but you don't need to really make much of it. We don't want to make a lot of it. We want to make a lot of the curating of this fantastic festival and all the thinking that you've done to make it truly intersectional, to make it vibrant, to make it accessible. What is your takeaway, Kanwal, on this digital festival? And hopefully we'll be live again next year.
Thank you. So as much as I hope that we are able to do this festival live face-to-face next year, but I still would like to, have some components taking place digitally, because, what digital allows you is this international, this intersectional, this interracial, this, this amazing access to not just people, but just to, let's say, to all those, it helps you almost, let's say, cut across all geographical boundaries, and, talking to people that you may otherwise would not be able to talk to. This particular rendition, again, we were particularly aware of, designing a set of programs which would allow us to not just bring to the table the issues that are politically, socially relevant, but we also wanted to celebrate womanhood and bring about some programs that, just celebrate what women have achieved so far, and not leave out, the achievements and the contributions that have been made by not just women, but by people who have not been in the main room so far. Again, people with technology have been making, let's say, during this last year, what we witnessed have been making decisions for people who don't have technology. And this is what was our main concern around designing the programs this year, that we do not leave them behind, since digital cuts across boundaries and timelines. So we should be having, let's say, programs that are multilingual, like Amne's just told you. All the programs have been PSL interpreted, and then there are subtitles added to it also for the programs that are that are English in language. So this whole ride of coming up with this festival has been quite surreal. It was almost like riding on a local Pakistani bus where you didn't know the route, and it had all those bumps and all those barriers, and you were bumping into so many weirdly interesting but important conversations and people. It had its own perks, it had its own problems, and and the ride is still going on.
Mm-hmm. When you started this festival, Amne and Kanwal, did you have you become more of an activist? I suppose that's my question, really. Has it changed your sense of the systemic nature of injustice, and therefore the need to give different tools to people to understand their lives, our lives?
I think I can address that for both of us, to say we do this because we think it's necessary. But what it does bring is a deeper understanding of the space we're trying to navigate. And Kanwal, would you agree?
Definitely. Again, as a storyteller, I get this is exactly what we do with this festival and with the other kind of stories that we tell.
Yeah. So it's a vehicle for your activism, but it also makes the range of things that you get to understand, even more critical. I did a session in the UK yesterday on grandmothers, because grandmothers is a sort of phrase that we use all over the world that sort of suggests something, homely, comfortable, always available, totally missing the fact that grandmothers are still women with lives to go, with ambitions still to go. Often they themselves are dealing with, poor health, they're dealing with poor economics, they're often still in violent relationships. There's all sorts of things that grandmothers, if you like, are experiencing. They're often given much too much care work, having already come through the caring of their children. And yet society's sort of imagery around grandmothers is so benign and unthoughtless, I think. So I'm always finding with the WOW festivals that we're exploring things which you might not think about if you're not a grandmother, but you suddenly, it opens up your eyes in a really extraordinary and wonderful way. And I was thinking, going back to personal reflections on this time, because at the very beginning of this discussion, Salima said, this has been a period of reflection. And I mean, just on a personal level, Natasha, what reflection have you had during the pandemic of a personal nature? I don't mean you have to completely reveal all your thinking, but what's it made you consider during this time of lockdown?
So I've been thinking about the lockdown a lot in terms of disability and women's labor. I feel like, given what the amount of labor I've seen my mother put in around my sibling's care, I feel like the world almost kind of caught up to her, because it impeded her mobility so much that I feel like I was able to also understand what she was going through as a result of the pandemic, and understand her positionality in terms of caregiving and all of that. So I feel like it has opened my eyes in some ways to women's labor, and how it can be so easily, her mobility can so easily be impeded with something as common as disability in the family, and especially if you're a single parent.
I think that thing of living close up to things that you hadn't perhaps observed so much before.
Yeah,
Sheil, what about you? You've got to go shortly, I know, but has anything happened to your thinking or your feelings during this pandemic that's taken you by surprise?
I think what's really come home to me is the vulnerability of the human race, actually. And I think it's been clear that as the pandemic struck, that there's some things that we just can't control. The second thing that follows is just to the point that Rachel made earlier, the distribution of load has been unequal, and you see that across households, and you see that generally with women taking the strain at home more than men in a number of situations. And I think that those are two reflections that are very high up in my mind.
Stevie, you also have got to go to another relentless day of Zooming, I'm sure. But what about you personally, as somebody who's always out, always networking, always loves connecting with people and always giving hugs? I know that's what you do. So what's the impact? What have you had to think about yourself personally during this time?
Thank you, Jude. Listen, it's been a torrid year for everybody, and we have coped with loss directly and indirectly of people and freedoms and liberations. But to be optimistic and upbeat for a second, I think that our physical world shrinking during lockdown has given time for and space for reflection to those of us who have been able to feel safe. And I really, really hope that some of that reflection and some of that learning maintains into, quote, the real world when some of our liberations are restored. I think that learning to be kind to ourselves and each other, I really, really hope maintains, because like Sushil, I think what we've done is shine a spotlight on inequity and inequality in a way that we have been forced to confront when we might have been avoiding. So I hope that some of the time we've had for reflection, and frankly, for many of us here today to count our blessings, that we count those blessings and use some of what we've learned to allow others to raise the bar.
Kulsoom, you talked movingly about not really being able to see your loved ones for a while, and also the huge anxiety of families thinking that their own loved ones might be putting themselves in danger, which I imagine your own family thought. Has it changed you, this pandemic, in terms of your priorities or your sense of identity?
Certainly. And I think I want to pick up where Stevie left off. I think it's made me recognize on a personal level the huge position of privilege that I personally come from. So I was able to continue to work. I had lots of support at home. But in highlighting my own privilege, it revealed the lack thereof for so many others who did not have the same kind of support. It just shone a light on a situation that perhaps otherwise would have been peripheral to my understanding. But appreciating what I had really put into the spotlight what others, particularly women, did not have. In the support at home, in a spouse who would pick up the slack with the kids' education, so many things that I think that came from my own personal position of privilege. I also saw some glimmers of hope. As Natasha was pointing out, I saw women reclaiming the neighborhood, children playing on the streets that used to happen 30 years ago when I might have also played on the streets. And we saw a rise within our neighborhood of a sense of community, a sense of belonging, and also a sense of entrepreneurship, largely driven by women who now at home, perhaps out of need, but also out of demand, providing goods and services out of their homes that I would love to see continue and flourish going forward. But there is something, coming back to your point about loss, that I think, and this has been talked about with the impact on mental health, that I don't think we've quite addressed yet. And as a nation, particularly, we have a particular way that we grieve and mourn. When somebody passes away, it doesn't even have to be someone who's very close to you. It could be a neighbor, it could be a friend's parent. We go, we visit the house, we are involved in rituals that really bring about closure for the family as well as the community. And I think that's going to have a ripple down effect that we haven't been able to have that closure. We've forgotten the people that we've lost in many ways. And when things do revert to some sort of a normal and you go out and you don't see the people that you expect to see, you realize you've lost them forever and you never had the time to actually come to some sort of closure for that. So it's been, it's been a full spectrum of personal optimism and appreciation of everything that I have, but also the counterbalance of that is just appreciating what others do not.
There's a lot of you talking about just the realization of inequity, the depths of inequity, the depths of privilege. Then the contrast to that, and how what you just talked about as well about like how we're going to actually grieve. Rachel, your final comments. I mean, you've expressed your anxiety about kind of like younger people having to sort of sacrifice dreams in order that the older generation are protected. Although I don't know many young people who don't want to protect the older generation because the older generation mean a lot to them. But what's been your takeaway from this so far?
So at a personal level, it's been fine for me. I've quite enjoyed not dashing around so much. I'm, in a very privileged position. I always thought I'd do well under house arrest or in prison, and so it turns out I don't go around hugging people in normal circumstances, and that's a bit of a plus. So I've done a lot of reading, and it's been fine at a personal level. The thing I've really cared about is I haven't seen my grandchildren for a very long time because they're not within walking distance of me. Three of them are in Japan, and I don't know when I'll see them next. Their education has been interrupted in ways I can't really assess. One of them has basically taken a year out of college. The other two are sort of, sometimes it's been Zoom, sometimes it's been the odd day at school. Another one has had, months out of school and then a few days in and so on. I see young people hanging out in the local parks. Actually, it's, as someone said a few minutes ago, they look as if they're having fun. They're all sitting in big circles drinking beer, and it's sort of back to the 1950s, and they don't have to hang out in malls, and they're kind of rediscovering some of the sort of simpler pleasures of life. But, you know, there's a huge amount of uncertainty about what the future holds for these kids. And that really does worry me. And I don't know at the personal level when I'm talking to my grandchildren, or at the theoretical level when I think about, you know, what does the future hold sort of more sort of in a more macro sense. I really don't know where this is all leading. And given the experience they've been through, that's the thing that really bugs me, actually. How do you enable kids to live through this, and the uncertainty and the very changed world that they may be moving into? That's my main worry, I have to say. I spent a lot of time contemplating.
I totally identify with the pain of not being able to see children, grandchildren, and worrying about their future. Salima, you started the conversation, and we're going to end the conversation with you with that extraordinary image of you as a 4-year-old on a donkey waving a white flag. And in a way, you said, I've been doing that ever since. I've been walking towards the future, speaking of peace. You've lived through extraordinary trauma and chaos. What's your feeling about how we best need to proceed for purposes of healing, for the purposes of change? What's your hope for us as we tackle the result of all of this?
Well, one's hope is that humankind has the ability to learn from this time of great suffering. And one has seen immense suffering, especially in the region where we live, where it has been to do with food, the lack of it, the inability to provide for families, very often falling in the woman's lap, the large number of domestic labor, which were women, the migrant laborers, their suffering, and so on and so forth. How much of this is going to permeate the minds of people at large is the major question. The word closure was mentioned. And I believe that, yes, we will have to have closure. It'll have to be universal closure. What its terms will be, how it is actually going to be articulated is the challenge. And because today we are celebrating women, I feel very strongly that it might be women and women only who carry the message of peace and some hope for the generations beyond our time. I think we need women.
Okay, that's a very fantastically fitting point to end. We need women. We need women who feel confident of their place in the world, that have the language, that have the sense of potential, and we need them to model that change for their children too. And so I hope that we all feel that WOW is a contribution into this world stage of change making. It's been a great privilege to host this panel. Thank you so much. And it's been brilliant to see the whole WOW Festival as it's unfolded in Pakistan. Here's to having it again next year live, but let's not underestimate how grateful we are to technology for being able to connect us like this. Lots of love, everybody. I think that's the bottom line, isn't it? We need to find as much love as possible and work out how to turn that into policy. So happy International